panel. We're very lucky that the next panel is all here in person. And so this is a sustainable textile and apparel session. As before, I'm going to do with some slides just because there are some visuals and some things you might not be familiar with. I'll do a very short scene setting presentation on what are some of the global trends in textile and apparel, or the global fashion industry, so in the global value chain. And what does that mean for windows of opportunity? So picking up again on this idea of green windows of opportunity, where are the technological changes happening, and therefore where are the opportunities for leapfrogging? And particularly in textile and apparel, which has for a long time been considered a sunset industry with extremely mature technology that hasn't changed very much. It was the industry, at least textile, that drove the first industrial revolution. Now I think we're at a point where we're seeing some technological changes for the first time, and we can think about not rebuilding textile and apparel sectors in African countries, but building new, and think of it as a sunrise rather than a sunset industry. And to do that thinking, I'm very happy to have a panel of private sector actors. So they all represent firms with investments in the industry, and also very West African focus. So we have Ursen Gune from Uniwax, which produces wax print fabrics, which if you are West African, you know what that means, based in Côte d'Ivoire. Then we have Bezait Tekelemariam from Arise, which is, okay, maybe I should let you explain the ownership structure, as it's very complicated. But they are building integrated industrial platforms in Africa, and started really in West Africa with Gabon, Togo, and Benin. And in Togo and Benin, these are in textile and apparel. And we'll particularly be looking at Pia, the industrial park in Togo. This thing just goes in and out. And then we have Dasun Batugadara, who's from the general manager, if I remember correctly, from DTRT, which is a large apparel assembly firm in Ghana, one of the only, or definitely one of the biggest, that has expanded recently. And we'll be talking about his company's investments in Ghana. So what I will do is lay out what I think are some of the opportunities and challenges, and then I'll invite the panel up. We'll begin the Q&A session, which I hope will be a dialogue. And also, actually, we don't need to wait for questions from the floor. So, you know, if you have a dying question, actually just put up your hand and I can stop and we can interact instead of waiting until the end, because we're a small group, so there's no need not to be inclusive. So everything that most of everything I'm gonna say, not all of it, is in this working paper, which is published by CBDS, where I'm co-director, and was originally produced for TBI under Chima, but they refused to publish it, so I have published it myself. It's an extremely long paper, so for policymakers, we wrote a 10-page summary, co-authored with Chima, which is also available on the CBDS website, and also there were copies in the back. Okay, next slide. So basically, and Chima and I came to this independently, but came to the same conclusions, that there are basically two significant global trends that are disrupting apparel global supply chain. So this morning I talked about how disruptions can create opportunities for African countries, because in its normal stasis, all the nodes are occupied. And this makes it very difficult for African firms and industries to break in, particularly, well, not particularly, I think most global value chains are like this. Once buyers have a relationship with a supplier, they're pretty much just like to keep to that supplier. You know them, they know you, it's trust. Whoever says that these are market-linked transactions, neoclassical economists are always wrong. There's a lot of social networking and social trust built. So buyers don't like to switch suppliers if they don't have to. So these disruptions create opportunities by making buyers look for different countries to produce in and even different firms. So these two global trends, the first one is, I've called it shorter and transparent global value chains, global supply chains. You might have heard of nearshoring, this is also part of it, or localization, or verticality, but those words aren't always obvious to non-academics, so I've tried to go with the most obvious words, which are shorter, so not these long, opaque global supply chains where inputs are flying around the world, cotton from Cote d'Ivoire to Bangladesh, or China to fabric, and then that fabric somewhere else, and then, you know, long, opaque supply chains where buyers may not even know all the actors that are actually in their supply chain. What moving to is shorter and transparent. So transparent meaning knowing who's in your supply chain. And that links to this point about due diligence laws that I talked about coming out in Europe and the US, where lead firms, in this case, we're talking about apparel brands and retailers. So brands own a brand. They may own a retail shop, but usually don't, and retailers they only own the retail shop, right? So H&M. They're being held responsible for what their suppliers are doing. And so this is leading to this trend of shorter and transparent. And the shorter, of course, is driven by several dynamics, by COVID, by the pandemic showing how vulnerable supply chains are, by geopolitical issues around China. Even though China's percentage of the global market in apparel has fallen, it's still the largest producer. So there are several trends that are driving this. I'm not going to spend time talking about that. But basically, it's led to new motivations, okay? So apparel brands and retailers want to source from countries that have yarn and fabric production in that country, or can source these from nearby countries, so a domestic or regional. And to be fair, to some extent, this has always been the case. That's why China dominated the market, because they had everything in one place. And those agglomeration economies, as we call in economics, lowered their cost. But this is even more so now. And this is driven by speed to market, which is driven by e-commerce, and by flexibility. Supplier firms that have access to diverse fabric supply, so a range of textures and types of dye materials, of finishings, of R&D and fabric, so that the buyer can work with the supplier to create a lot of different kinds of products. This gives more flexibility, and suppliers can do this when everything is co-located. Not in the same firm. Like in India, there are clusters of firms, or it can even be across several countries. But the point is that it meets the two needs of buyers, which is to have speed to market and flexibility and transparency. I think, the due diligence comes on the next slide. And so what this means is vertical integration of spinning, fabric, and apparel assembly in the same location is more important than cheap labor costs. In some sense, it always has been, but now even more so, except on maybe your most basic t-shirts, which is why that's all you got in Ethiopia for a long time, because Ethiopia is not actually a competitive location at all. So as I said, China still has the largest share in the global apparel market, but it wants alternatives, and the existing alternatives are almost saturated and have their own problems, right? So this creates opportunities for new sourcing locations, and at the moment, actually, Central American countries are benefiting the most from this. You see new investments in spinning and textile and new investments in apparel in small Central American countries, which means there is an opportunity for African countries to tap into. They can do so, but they need to have yarn and fabric production. As we show in the report, the continent continues or has very limited spinning and textile being knit and woven. And at the moment, apparel buyers are content with that because they, except a few special ones that Chima has been working with, if it was available, they would source, but they're not actually going to put their time and effort into building it up. If they can find actors like Arise that they can work with, they're happy to do that. But gone are the days, like in the 60s, in South Korea and Taiwan, where buyers would directly, or even Sri Lanka in the 1980s, where buyers directly went in and made joint ventures. Those days are gone, okay? But we do see, oh, previous slide, please. We do see some of this evidence of buyer demand, and I just wanted to point out that Hella, which is a Sri Lankan firm that's set up a new factory in Kenya, has been collaborating with a textile mill in Tanzania that was supplying the domestic market. It had existed for a long time to build their capabilities to supply textile in the region. So this is a case of a first-tier supplier, not a buyer, but a first-tier supplier, working with an existing local firm to help it increase its capabilities. Why would it do that? Business strategy. Business strategy drives the motivation of partnerships and joint ventures. African countries need to increase their textile production that can meet the speed, quality, and cost standards. And so on this slide, which I normally use to give presentations, I talk about the cases of Togo and Ghana, but I don't need to talk about the cases of Togo and Ghana because we have people here who are going to talk about the cases of Togo and Ghana, which is about attracting foreign investments into verticality. So I want them to talk about why were they attracted to Togo and Ghana to invest in textile production, because these are not just cases of apparel. And to talk about, so here I'm already posing some questions to you, to talk about the varying extent to which government policies played a role in that, and to which they didn't. And I think is to be honest, what were the incentives to invest there, and to what extent did government policy drive that incentive, or come in later, or support it, etc. Next slide. So the second global trend is what I call greening the global fashion industry, or sometimes I call it the sustainability shift, same thing. Basically, I've seen this slide before, it's just an easy way to show it. The full circle is the whole life cycle of production. So you have raw material, yarn to fabric, treating of the fabric, cut, make, and trim, retail, transport, product use, and even in use. So this is the whole life cycle of a garment in terms of its GHG emissions. And what's really interesting is the extent to which material production accounts for 38% of that. Okay. And I should also say that depending on who you ask, they'll give you different numbers, and it depends on how they calculate it. I have that global fashion industry accounts for 6 to 8%. Some think it's all the way up to 10. Depends on what you throw in there. Also, if you read the footnotes on how these things are actually calculated, it's a little bit dubious. But many people say that if you not just take GHG, but you take water pollution, water use, effect on the environment, and biodiversity, that clothing is the second most damaging industry, which is quite shocking because we think of heavy industry as being above that, and it's actually more polluting than flights and shipping. And I stress that because you can say, why are buyers doing something about this? This is why they're doing something about this, because they're being pressured by their governments and their publics to do something about this. So GHG emissions come from the production process. Largely, this is brown energy and textile, and then it's raw materials. Most of it is because synthetic fibers come from oil, and synthetic fibers account for over 50% of the fibers in the clothing that you're wearing. But also, cotton is highly polluting in terms of pesticides, fertilizers, and the extent of use of water, which has other effects on societies. So the reason I emphasize this is because it's in material production where we're seeing the biggest push for change. Next slide. Just to quickly point out, so you think I'm not making this up, two of the biggest drivers are the EU strategy for sustainable and circular textiles, which came out last year in March. And I've just summarized on the board some of the key, and it's a big text, and it's in the process of being implemented, but it's in the process of being implemented. It is being implemented, and firms lead buyers knew that this was coming many years in advance, which is why they already started their actions before we even saw the text. So some of the key things here are setting mandatory minimums for the inclusion of recycled fibers in textile. This is really driving the creation of a market for recycled textile fibers. Banning of the destruction of unsold property. That's also boosting the market because unsold property and defects can no longer be destroyed, they have to be recycled. Requiring apparel sold in Europe to be longer lasting and easier to repair. New EU rules on waste shipments. So we all think of Ghana as the home for secondhand clothing, but actually, under the new rules, European countries will not be able to ship secondhand clothing to a third-party developing country if it doesn't have in process a way to treat that. Yes, really, really good plans for it. So all of these things mean that there is a high demand for alternatives to virgin fibers, a way to use secondhand clothing, moving away from the fast fashion model, yeah? And so what we can see is that if we did this analysis with my PhD student where we looked at the top 10 global apparel buyers and we looked in their sustainability reports that are publicly available and we looked at their targets, and you can see that most have targets to reduce scope 3 emissions by at least 20% by 2030, with H&M having the most ambitious goal of 56% reduction. They all have recycled or sustainable fiber targets, but H&M has the highest of 100% recycled or sustainable fibers by 2030. The only ones that don't are TJX, Uniqlo, and no surprise, Shein. But what I think we're gonna see is that in these top 10, the first movers will set the standard in the industry and the rest of the lead firms, the global buyers, will follow soon because they were basically creating new business models. And in doing that, they are also innovating and seeking to invest in new technologies. And so this leads to the last slide, but I wanna say it's these two things here, EU legislation and global firm business strategies that are driving innovations and financing for startup firms and new fiber technologies. Next slide. So this is a bit small on this slide, but I just wanted to emphasize the sort of scope, the depth and width of what's happening, because if you aren't me and you haven't done the research, then you're not aware that these things are going on. You might be aware that there's recycled polyester, but it's actually happening rapidly. And before it was only plastic bottles or other forms of plastic that could be turned into new polyester fibers, but now there's technology that can go fiber to fiber. You might have known that there's recycled cotton and mechanical, but the innovations in chemical recycling have increased dramatically. It can take blended textiles, so most of the clothes we wear is actually part synthetic and part cotton, and this has been a hurdle. But because of these drivers on the previous slide, they have given a business opportunity and driven startup venture capital financing and capital from global apparel firms like H&M, who have made huge investments in these startup fiber firms, but not just H&M, Patagonia, other B Corp firms. So venture capital and sustainable issues and global lead firms are investing in these new technologies, and that's why in the last 3 to 4 to 5 years, the progress we have made in humanity in these innovations are quite impressive, which shows you that there's no problem with the technology and our ability as humans. It's always the business case. Waits for the business case, and then you see progress. And what we're seeing now is all kinds of technologies creating virgin natural fibers out of alternative to cotton. So cotton like hemp, fibers from agricultural waste, from coconut to pineapple fibers, you name it. Leather made out of all kind of bio-based materials. Regenerative man-made cellulosic fiber. So you can transform cellulosic biomaterials from anything that's cellulose, that's natural, into new textile fibers. So this can be wood pulp, all newspapers, straws, textile waste that has been generated from this up here where you took synthetic and cotton textile. When we say textile waste, it also means secondhand. So you can take it and you can, the technologies now, you can separate the cotton, or basically the cellulosic material, onto one side and the polymers into another, and you can keep them as polymers, or you can break them down into monomers, and then you can process separately. And the cellulosic pulp will go to be made into regenerative cellulosic fiber. But we also see really interesting things going on in microbial cellulosic fibers. You can use fermentation processes to grow fibers from biomass. So you introduce a microbe into coconut water waste in Thailand, and you can produce something after several steps of patented technology that feels just like cotton. And then the most recent, but I think will be in the longer term, the actual technology that wins out, is bioengineered fiber. So you can use mycelium cells from mushrooms, and you can even use protein-based alternatives that can create something that's just as good as synthetic from oil. So these are all either in startup, pilot, or moving to commercial phase. Yeah? And as I said, global apparel buyers are supporting and investing
Recording in progress.
in firms that are pioneering. I've looked at their ownership structure, I looked at their financing structure, and you can see that they're investing in it to create an alternative because they don't have one yet. So you can't say, well, there's no demand. There is a demand from buyers for these types of materials. For certain types of buyers that are pioneering it, like H&M, and who will probably have IPRs in this tech. But importantly, and this is one of the criteria when I looked into these firms, many of them plan to license this technology or already do. So for the older tech, they may already do. For the new tech, they will probably license it in the future. Last slide. So what does all this mean? Well, I think it's pretty obvious, but I'll just draw it together. Buyers are looking for suppliers, this is both apparel and textile, along the supply chain, fiber to garment, that can help them realize sustainable and circular business models. This is an opportunity for African countries to build green textile and apparel from the start. Asia's textile and apparel sectors are not green. It means they have to start from a similar place as African countries. But remember what I said at the beginning, of course, firms and countries that have accumulated experience in textile have an advantage because the textile tech itself is not really changing. Spinning is not changing. Weaving and knitting is not really changing. There are innovations like on the margin that can use less water, that can do better finishings, and those individual equipments are new, particularly, say, in denim production. But the basic technology is not changing. So the countries that already have experience in textile will have an easier time, but they're not necessarily ahead of African countries. But my main argument, which is the same one I said this morning, is that if we want this to be more than just catching up to the tail of everybody else, if we want it to be actually leapfrogging, African firms need to invest in the new fiber technologies. This includes in the recycling and the next generation of textile technologies. And also, obviously, all of this needs to be fueled by renewable energy because in textile, the biggest GHG emissions are in brown energy. But I think there is an alternative, there is an opportunity to escape somewhat the fast fashion model, which is very exploitative to labor. And I will just end by saying that the benefits to the textile sector have always been in textile, not in assembly. Assembly does not, and has never, since it was invented in the 1920s with the Singer sewing machine, has never driven industrialization. You cannot drive industrialization with apparel. There is no tech involved. Okay? It has to be in textile and fiber, and now, in the 21st century, in 2020, it's in fiber tech, yeah? So African TNA industries need to be based on mastering the next generation of fiber production technology. And I think that this opens up spillover opportunities because these technologies I was just laying out to you, and the reason I went into detail in them is because I think that many of them are what we call general purpose technologies, meaning they have applications beyond the sector in which they are introduced. Not to the extent that computers did, okay? That's what we call general purpose technology. But mycelium has an ability to be applied to a lot of things. It's bioengineering, it's chemistry. If you build skill sets and knowledge in those industries and firms that can do that, that can be applied in other sectors and drive spillovers, but also innovation in other sectors. So what we're seeing is that there would be a benefit beyond just building a textile and apparel industry. And also in recycling technologies, there could be spillovers in terms of how to manage your sectoral waste management systems. So I'm gonna stop there. I know it's a little bit long, but I really wanted to give you an impression of what we really mean by green windows of opportunity and the kind of technologies that are literally just emerging on the scene with venture capital funding raised just last year, and some of these really interesting protein, for example, protein-based fibers. So now I'm gonna invite the panelists to join me on the stage. And while they're coming up there, I'll say I'm gonna first ask each one to introduce themselves and mostly their company. I know their companies very well, but you probably do not. So you'll have a little bit of an idea about what they do. And then I'm gonna pose one question to each where we look at what are the sustainability aspects of their current operations. And then I'm gonna push them to think about how do they think that maybe not just their firms, but other firms and industries could emerge to take advantage of the windows of opportunity that I was pointing to. So I think we'll just go in the order that we're sitting in. So decide, do you want to introduce Arise to us?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. People are sleeping. What happened? Too much food. Okay. I am representing Arise, Arise IIP. I'm the sustainability manager for Arise. Currently, we have textile operation in Togo and Benin. But to give you an overview as to what does Arise do, Arise is currently setting up industrial infrastructure in different countries within Africa. The full model is wherever there are gaps when it comes to industrialization and utilization of resource locally, Arise partners with government to set up economic zones which will utilize the existing resource within the country. That is with the aim to create jobs, but also to make sure that the value addition that needs to happen within the country is done. So export value will increase, technology transfer, and with the partnerships that we are having with the government, governments are able to lead their strategic areas together with us in these platforms. We started in Gabon. So Gabon, we have industrial park, which is mainly timber processing. Then we have set in Togo and Benin. Both Togo and Benin, they have already started operating. Right now, there are new industrial economic zones which are being opened in Congo, DRC, Rwanda, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Chad, and recently Sierra Leone. So the same model, all our economic zones are in partnership with the government, and it's with the aim to fill in any gaps that are happening within the country with a long-term strategy.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ersin Gunay. I'm the managing director of Uniwax. from the Ivory Coast in Abidjan. So Uniwax is a company that belongs to the Vlisco group. I think the Vlisco brand also is well known here in Ghana. So the Vlisco group has 4 brands in total. Vlisco brand itself in the Netherlands. We have Uniwax in the Ivory Coast and GTP here. So I'm sure for the Ghanaian amongst us, they are well familiar with the GTP brand. And next to that, we have a Pan-African brand, which is called Wooden. And all these 4 brands, well, 3 of them are produced in Africa, while one and the only one is from the Netherlands, which is the Dutch wax. So to get back to Uniwax, we produce about 25 million years a year. That's a very big quantity of textiles. We have about 750 people working in Abidjan, in a factory that basically turns 24/7 the whole year. And we sell our products in the Ivory Coast, but also beyond. So about 35% of our products get exported to the region. And maybe one thing to add is that maybe not a lot of, I would say, Africans know that, but in the whole world, there are only 2 factories that produce wax print textiles using wax. One is in Abidjan, and the other one is in the Netherlands. And that in itself, I think, is something to be proud of, and also something to protect. Now, I think any product, of course, will live as long as there is demand and there's a unique selling point and value to consumers. But I think knowing the wax print market here in Africa, there is something that we have to be aware that a lot of it is being counterfeited and coming from Far East. And I think that's also one of the part of the discussion that I would like to have today, is that somehow we also participate, contribute to this problem by not addressing the value chain and all the basically technological shifts that are ongoing as we speak. And someone else is basically taking our lunch. So I would like to keep it at that, and then we'll talk more later.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dasun. I'm representing DTRT. I'm the Chief Finance Officer. DTRT stands for Do the Right Thing Apparel. So just want to say, so whatever we do right and make sure it's affecting the society in a right way. And the business started in 2013 and co-founded by US national and a German national. And then we had a collaboration in 2019 with Red Bull and Verod Capital Nigeria. So it's a now partnership with all 4 of the shareholders. And a business, like we had about 2,000 employees up to 2021. After the COVID, like we were significantly increase our operation to bring it up to 5,000 employees within like 1.5 years time. And we have 2 manufacturing units in Ghana. One is in Accra. We have about 2,500 employees, and the other one is in Tema. So there are also about 2,500 employees. So we mainly manufacturing sportswear garments, mainly into t-shirts, polos, and hoodies. And we are predominantly exporting into US market for now, but we are bringing new customers, and we got a couple of new customers this year onboarded. And we have huge expansion plans coming up, and we are going to get another facility in Tema, planning to expand it to like another 5,000 facility of operators. Yeah, so the marketing is happening from USA. We have a separate office there, and we are sourcing office in China. And mainly Ghana, we do the manufacturing businesses in Ghana. So whatever we produce and ship it out from Ghana. Yes, thank you.
So I will join you now, so this can be a conversation. I'll start with you, Bezai. Can you explain a little bit, or a lot of bit, about the sustainability aspects of this? Just focus on PIA to make it easier, which has a bigger textile and apparel focus than the one in Benin. But when you read the website, it says PIA is built with sustainability in mind, and ARISE characterizes itself as promoting green industrialization in Africa, which I didn't actually remember until I revisited the website a few days ago, that it actually says green industrialization. So can you explain the sustainability aspects of PIA, and also linked to that, on the website it also says ambition to be carbon neutral, and I remember when I was interviewing the general manager there, the plans around solar technology as well.
I think with regards to overall sustainability agenda that we have, it works for all ARISE projects. So PIA doesn't have a separate ambition. All the ambitions that we have, it works for all our operations in every country. So we have 4 major pillars: supply chain management system, circularity, we have carbon neutral, and we have the inclusion. So these are the 4 areas that we want to work on. Our project in Togo, it started 2021. So it's very early stage for us to show any results or publish anything. But the ambition is that we want to make sure that all our operation and all the tenants that are coming into the industrial park, they go according to these ambitions that we are having. PIA, it's an economic zone. That means we want to make sure that we have a facility which looks into these strategic areas. With that in mind, of course, renewable energy is one of the areas. We are assessing renewable energy potentials, not just for the park, but beyond that, because I think there is a lot that can be done when it comes to renewable energy. And there is a big potential, we do understand that. So there is a team working on that. We have to see how they will assess the potentials beyond the park, and of course it needs to make it should be economically viable as well. That being said, the other biggest focus is circularity. When we think of textile industry, I think that addressing waste is it's the biggest issue. And in countries where waste management is not well structured, where there are already an existing issues all around, bringing an industry which will adapt to that will be a big concern for everyone. So having a recycling plant, that's part of ARISE strategy. We have already started connecting with investors and assessing what the potentials are when it comes to recycling. That's mainly for fabric, because that will be the biggest waste that we are going to have. Hopefully we will be able to start all the projects at the same time so that we can make sure that there is no risk factor when the factories are up and running. Generally, as to where we are right now we have started working on social and environmental impacts for the projects that are coming. That's an initial stage that we always work on. We have already started community and government consultations because those impact assessments need to be aligned, and we need to have a proper mitigation plan, because projects that come in, it's not that we are investing in them, but they need to address those things while they're building up the projects. That's the first priority. The second priority is we have started training centers. That's one of the things that PIA is doing, because whenever tenants are coming, skill is a big issue. To address the skill factor, training centers are already in place, so they have already started conducting training. So when manufacturers are in place, there is a trained workforce that can easily be injected into the industry that's coming up. I think when we think of the overall progress, the ambition of PIA is in line with the government. PIA is a partnership with ARISE and the Togolese government. It's done in partnership. That means the areas that we work on is a strategic area for the government as well. So we are getting the support that is needed. But I think that there is always a missing component, because whenever we talk about industrialization, there is a tendency that we talk about one sector, one component of the big puzzle. So it's always good to make sure that we keep on working with the government so that the missing puzzles are in place. So having the needed infrastructure, and there are a lot of works that needs to be done to enable the whole process, because it needs to be economically viable. Yeah? Whenever we talk about green industrialization, it's not about climate agenda, energy agenda only. It needs to be economically viable. So those are the works that we have started.
I just wanted to ask one follow-up thing in case it wasn't clear to the audience. So the model in PIA, and they're different. So the model in PIA is to have 2 vertically integrated knit fabric units and to source the cotton in the region. So we'll come back to the cotton issue, but I wanted to talk about, because these are investments in spinning, and you don't see many investments in spinning on the continent at the moment. So it's investing in spinning and knit fabric production and dyeing and finishing, and then that will be provided to the garment manufacturers that then invest in. So garment manufacturers are coming to set up apparel assembly in PIA, and they are helping to train the labor. I've already been in the factories and seen the training, so the labor will already be there, which was a problem in Ethiopia. But I think so the 2 things I wanted to ask if you could elaborate on quickly. The model is that these vertical textile investments are actually made by Arise, if I understand it correctly. And that's a different model than we've seen anywhere. And so I just wanted you to say briefly sort of what is the business case for that from your perspective? And I think understanding that business case is very important for replicating it. So understanding what attracted FDI in this sense. I mean, I understand, but I wanted you to explain it to the audience. And also that sustainability, as it was presented to me, is also in every step of this, because it's being set up new today. The circularity you mentioned and no waste is at every single step using state-of-the-art technology, including effluent treatment plant. And this is one of the main things that many Asian factories lack. And this definitely gives, I think, an advantage over countries. I mean, even India still, they don't have effluent treatment plants in many factories, and it just goes right into the river. So I think it's important, although effluent plants have become mainstream, it's not new tech, but it doesn't always exist in many Asian countries. So to explain what is the business case for setting up this, what I think is a highly innovative model, and if we can somehow reproduce it, that would be great.
I think, as you have said, sustainability, it's part of the business. So when we do assessments in any country, one of the components that will be seen is how can we make sure that sustainability is business-wise viable. So, for example, if we consider our project in Gabon, it is a project that it's not a new concept, but when we started engaging, now we have set up a lot of technologies when it comes to addressing carbon. So there are a lot of things in place. Looking into the trend, I think sustainability will make business sense. We know that. That is not a question. The question is, how much do you want to invest right now? That's always the question. Long term, we do know that every investment that we are putting in, we back. That's why when it comes to water treatment, conventional water treatment in most countries, legally it's there. But we are going to put a zero liquid discharge so that there is wastewater that's going to be released. So we are trying to push it a bit further so that it will make us more competitive. So it is a competitive, that's how we see it, because I don't think we will be able to beat the knowledge that Asia is having when it comes. It's not going to happen. We always have conversations, and we do listen buyers. I have been a buyer as well, so I understand the mindset that Asia has a database about textile which cannot be compromised. So there is a lot of things that we cannot question when it comes to competitiveness. So sustainability is the best competitive advantage for Africa. That is not questionable. So while the rest of the world spends time cleaning up, we have the opportunity to start properly from the beginning. When we say that, I think the biggest thing that everyone needs to understand, that requires money. Yeah? So we talk about renewable energy, we talk about recycling, we talk about a lot of things. These things require financial monetary needs. That's one thing. And it requires enabling environment. I think renewable energy, where in the equator we talk about price of energy. And it shows that there must be an enabling environment for renewable energy to be promoted. I think the solar developers all over the world would die to come here. They would love to come here. But the enabling environment is not there. So they are not here. We have to be realistic. Because solar is a good business. Yeah, it is a good business. We don't, if someone is questioning that, I would be surprised. It is not a good business only in Ethiopia because the government have subsidized the hydro projects. But in other countries, I think it's a good business. So we should always remember the enabling environment is what will allow for private sector to engage more. Coming back to having investors which are willing to take a risk, of course, that would be ideal, right? You need one or two companies who are willing to jump, then the rest will follow. As I have said, that is ideal. You have those. When you have those, I think governments need to support them so that they don't fail, because businesses do fail, projects do fail. So it's good to recognize when there is a bold move, then governments are backing it so that the spillover effect can have a bigger impact in the country.
Thank you. Somehow I think those points have so much more effect when you say them than when I do. So let's move on to Ersin. I had some questions for you, but then actually we were talking and you mentioned that that I think a year and a half ago, the company was taken over by a Dutch equity firm. And in this context, you can really see how some of these issues I was talking about around due diligence matter. And the acronym in the West is ESG. I don't know if anyone has heard of that, environmental, social, and governance criteria, which are now coming into play in many different ways in legislation and even in finance. That affect firms, that then cause those firms in the West to look at their supply chain going down. And you are part of feeling that going down and its impact on UNIWAX and Abidjan. So could you say a little bit about what that means on a daily basis for you and how that is affecting the company?
Yeah, sure. I'll try to give some examples of that. So as you said, we have been taken over by a Dutch private equity firm. Before that, the Vlisco Group was owned by a UK-based private equity firm. And as you can imagine, in private equity, it's buying cheap and selling expensive, right? So it's a short-term business where you need to create value so that you can, of course, make your investors also happy. That's, I guess, private equity textbook as we all know it. But nowadays, it becomes also about ESG. So we are bound to follow certain regulations, principles, and code of conduct that in this region can be in your disadvantage. I'll give an example. The bank that has partly financed the purchase of the Vlisco Group is putting a lot of, I would say, requirements and conditions for knowing your customer, cash payments, and all that is linked to that. Now, in this part of the world, in our business, it's still a cash-driven business. That is something that in Europe is seen as a disadvantage, as a risk. So that in itself makes investors in Europe uncomfortable. Another one is governance. Right? When it comes to bribes, fraud, corruption, all these things that we know, unfortunately, being a part of reality, is something that also makes, I would say, investors be more careful when it comes to investing in Africa. And I think that is something that we are reliant on our practices, but we also need the government to be basically putting in place policies, regulations to make these steps together. Because if not, we might not ever have serious investors coming over here, simply because of these reasons. And the environmental factor is part of that, but the government and also social, I think, is equally a part of it. So.
To follow up, and so on the environmental side, because often I work at a business school, not in the mainstream parts, but when I go to events in the mainstream parts, there's a discussion about somehow S and G are definitely getting more traction than the E. So are there any discussions, has that prompted any discussions around cotton and virgin cotton use and the textile parts, or has it not really trickled down yet?
Yeah, no, I think there are, on the cotton, I can maybe mention 3 particular things. So first of all, you mentioned in the introduction and during your presentation that basically to get textiles in Uniwax, we make a whole tour around the world. Ivory Coast is the 3rd biggest producer of cotton, at least last year in the continent, and 99.99% gets basically exported to mostly Asia. And we all know that textiles are being imported into Africa. So there's a huge gap when it comes to basically transforming cotton that is readily available. So I think that is one part of the transparency and also the emissions and all the impact on the environment that we as Uniwax would like to avoid. The second thing is that buyers, as you mentioned, are now also more careful of the sources of their cotton. And I think the Uyghur policy that has been adopted by European and US policymakers is forcing buyers to look for alternative sources. In our, with what we try to do is, there is a certification that is called Cotton Made in Africa, CMIA, to basically have a product that is also truly African. We source a majority of our cotton that actually certified African cotton. And that actually pains my heart that we are producing a product here, making a product here that could be 100% African, but isn't today simply because of the value chain. And our ambition is to fill those gaps. So basically the vertical integration that will have both environmentally a positive effect, will be more transparent, will be more. Finally, what we are doing here is basically.
But so are you talking about investments in spinning? I know we had this conversation before, but your company wouldn't make investments in spinning. So you as a company are actually trying to incentivize spinning companies or vertically integrated textile companies to set up operations in Côte d'Ivoire,
Yes.
in West Africa? Or so what do you see as the main, I mean, Chima and I have talked about this in our policy brief, but from Chima's experience, but what do you see as the main requirements that, and I don't know if they're primarily Chinese or not, are looking for? I mean, I don't know if you're aware of the Uyghur Act, so basically, you can't source cotton or textile from large parts of China, but because it can be rerouted, basically many buyers are saying we're not going to source cotton textile from China full stop, which is another one of these windows of opportunity for short-term cotton use. But what do you, so how can we attract investments in spinning into African countries? What are investors looking for?
Yeah, I think to be quite frank, there's not a lot to be done. And I say that because we know that since years now, China is becoming more expensive. So it's not only production costs that are increasing and labor over there, but as you said, there is an opportunity here because companies that are based here are looking for ways of nearshoring, shortening their value chain, especially after COVID. And in addition to that, buyers are more interested in buying products that they can truly follow transparently to the source. So with our Chinese partner, and I say Chinese partner because Vlisco is a company that exists now for 180 years. Uniwax is going into its 56th year. We have partners in Far East that have been working for many decades together with us, and they do know our importance in this region. So we have already actually convinced them to come over and invest, which is in their interest because, as I said, producing in China is also becoming more difficult, keeping in mind the cost, but also the sourcing problem. And they do know that there is a major potential. I mean, the textile and apparel market here in this region is growing significantly year on year. So I guess there are some short-term measures that have to be taken, but more importantly, where maybe what we will talk about later on is what is the vision of the government, what is the vision of the private sector, and can we basically merge those two? On the short term, I think there are maybe some transitionary measures that have to be taken to convince spinners and weavers to come and install here. On the long term, I think that's not enough. We have to really anchor the policy making on the next technological shift. That is, I think, the long-term vision. On the short term, I'll just give an example. When you go into spinning and weaving, most logically you start by weaving, but to be able to weave, you need the yarn, and the yarn has to be spun. So what we are asking the Ivorian government is that for a transitional period, we get basically exemptions for the yarn that we will have to import for a certain period of time. So yeah, that's why I said I think the business climate, the investment climate here is favorable. The opportunities are there. The demand is here. We just need to find the right partnerships and have a government that is willing to also support and facilitate, because we're not asking too much, honestly.
And I think that, you know, of course, I was saying that the government shouldn't lead, and I still believe that, but but that doesn't mean that I am saying there's no role for the government. And it definitely, I think you can form partnerships when there's not a lot of support, but obviously you can do more when there is support. So in that short period where the Ethiopian government was not just supportive, but proactive, and literally a small group in the government, let's be clear, proactively toured parts of China, including Jiangsu, the big textile, one of the big textile areas. You have
Xinjiang, I
yeah,
think.
Yes, thank you. Whereas Alexis would be much better at the Mandarin than I would. He's not paying attention. I mean, you had investments in linen yarn production. Now, I think that's great, but it's very cut off, so there's not the whole supply chain in Ethiopia. But just the fact that you would have a Chinese company, and I have seen this state-of-the-art textile factory inside, absolutely amazing. Huge problem with communication. Nobody speaks English. We can come back to that. But how do you train a workforce when they can't communicate? But the factory itself is absolutely amazing. And when you talk about the business case, they had a lot of willingness to set up flax yarn linen spinning, and it's the biggest supplier of linen yarn in the world. So, I mean, I could go on and on, but the point is that the demand, I think we are at windows of opportunity where with very small policies, like very small government support, not massive amounts of spending money, but actually it's more that the government seems to be interested. But I mean, I guess we could talk about the problems of getting the Ivorian government to seem interested. But I'll stop there because we have to go on to Dasun. But I think we'll come back to it. But it's to come up. I mean, the things that the government needs to do are not always a lot, but it's actually to be genuinely interested, right? And to have a vision. But I want to move on to the home turf. DTRT, and I didn't know that that's what it stood for, so that's awesome. So you have a huge apparel assembly, and then we could say, okay, that's not so beneficial. It's okay place to start, but I think what's more interesting is this new investment downstream in textile, and most of what you produce has a large synthetic requirement because it's for the US market under AGOA, and that's where the tariff benefits are. But then the company, and I talked to the founder on Zoom, has decided to invest in textile in Timma, right? And not just, but to try to use recycled polyester technologies. And these are also technologies that they have been part of pioneering with partner factories in Asia. So
yes.
Not their own textile. They don't own textile.
Yeah.
They're just two guys who used to work It's a long story anyway. So could you tell us, I think that's fascinating, and again, we need to understand the business case and the motives behind it in order to see how this can be supported and replicated.
Yeah.
What is the business case in a way
Okay.
for investing in that? And a little bit about the technologies, if you
Sure.
know.
The reason being, like you mentioned in the presentation, like we can't grow only manufacturing or assembling the garments. So we definitely need the vertical integration, which is very important, not only as a company and as a region. So we want to get the first move advantage and go ahead and start building up a fabric mill. And so we had done a lot of research. We got so many consultants in on the research point. And the reason being, like the customers also pushing us to be more sustainable, and to be sustainable and giving results is not like in very short time you can't give it. So it's a long-term plan. So we decided, okay, let's try to do a fabric mill. That initially, as a first phase, what we do is we will get the plastic chips from China. They are the one we currently buying, mostly the fabrics coming from China. So we have a long-term relationship with them. So we are working with them for like now 10 years. So they're going to give us fabric chips, and and they will do the yarn for now, and they will yarns for us, and we will do the fabric, the manufacturing here. We'll do the knitting here, and then we can start for the assembly line. So those are like colored yarns. So just it's a kind of technology they don't want to do the changes in the colors and all. Just extrusion type of technology they use. So through the extrusion they get the yarn, and so we will do the manufacturing in the fabric here. So this is the first phase. Then they have another option that we can get it, the recycled chips imported from them, and we can extrude it from here. So that's a phase number 2 which we do. So we're gonna do the yarn here, and then manufacturing the fabric, and then producing the garments. So the timelines, like we were gonna start 2024 end, the installation of the fabric mill, and the IFC also collaborated with us. So they are financing us with 14 million US dollars for that investment, which is part of 50% goes to fabric mill, and 50% is going for the assembly of garments. So with that, we are very positive, and we know that is achievable goal, because in African region, I know it's very difficult to get the financing done. So it's now actually the things we need to put it in the plan and start moving the milestones. And that's like 3 phases that we discussed. And the other one, what we need to do is like all the second-hand clothes come into Ghana. So we were trying to get recycled those in later by using some technologies, and try to get the same that we are going to get it from China. And we were trying to get that chips here. So we are trying to manufacture here, then we can continue the same process. So, but it's a long-term journey. So I'm just saying you that this is our vision that we want to do as a sustainable apparel that we want to do here.
And could you just say why that vision? Like, where does that vision come from?
Like everyone knows, and you also explained, like, so we are the second polluter to the global, right? So as a community, and we should not let our generations to suffer in future. So at least we should take small steps. Maybe in future it will be helpful for everybody to understand these issues coming up. So they will be work together, and I'm sure if you have a problem, you should definitely able to find a solution as a group, as a community. Because I know, like H&M, Adidas, they start manufacturing recycled clothes and shoes, and also, yes. So since brands have so much pressure on these things, so definitely the suppliers also should get that requirements coming up as a compliance requirements in future, or else when they are evaluating suppliers, maybe they say, okay, so they have more potential and they are more positive in terms of sustainability and standpoint. So maybe we'll give some more orders for them. So we also want to be more competitive in that. So so that's why we wanted to evaluate all those options. Yeah.
So we're quickly running out of time. So if there are questions on the floor, please raise your hand. And can anyone let me know if there are questions in the chat box or hand raised? Okay. Shima?
So thank you so much. First of all, I'm so excited about this panel. And what's exciting about what's happening in West Africa, maybe for the other participants who are not necessarily too much into the textiles and apparel, is that what we've seen in other countries generally is that many countries have developed the apparel segment first, reach a certain critical mass, created a market for textiles, and then integrated textiles. And some of them have not even succeeded in that. North African countries like Tunisia and Morocco have integrated some denim, but not necessarily all the textiles that they are producing for apparel. So that's what makes your role right now, whether Arise, Uniwax, or DTRT, super exciting. So, and I hope like in 10 years' time, we're gonna regroup and talk about the exception of West African textiles and apparel. But I wanted to come back on Arise, Beza, a bit on the plans for textile mills. Do you have a timeline for them exactly? Because I've been talking a bit to Vikas, and the timeline is still unclear. And for which markets exactly are you? Who would be your client for your textile mill? Is it the factories that are set in now in PIA, including Star Garment, etc.? Or how do you see that? Or is it with regional value chains, maybe with Benin and other companies in the region?
Are there other questions? Oh, Ed?
Yeah, thank you. This has been extremely insightful. I think this is the first time I'm learning about all these things happening. And Lindsay, thanks so much for the work you're doing. We appreciate it. And we need to deepen our partnership with you. I have two questions, but I think one is to Lindsay on the Ethiopian model as against what is happening here. I would like to get a little bit more of the insights in that. And the reason why is that some years back, you know, with Akabe, who used to be I think the Minister for Trade and Industry and also advisor to the Prime Minister, we had a workshop in Rwanda, in Ethiopia, and went to the Hawassa Park, where you had a textile company and then the apparel also there. And they also have ESG generally because they are also processing the effluent and so on. So, but I seem to get a sense that you are saying that that model has not been that successful, so I just want to get some clarity on what is happening here in the West African region and what the Ethiopian model is. That's the first one. And the second one is related to the synthetic fiber issue, which I think you all raised. And you were making the case that oil, you're sort of deriving some kind of synthetic fiber using oil. Now the question is, well, what is the carbon footprint? In other words, is this going to be really green if you're still depending on oil, you know, to be able to have these synthetic derivatives, you know, which are substitutes for the current naturally grown cotton and so on. So I just wanted to, again, maybe I didn't put the question well, but I guess we can talk about that. So I'll stop here for the moment.
Elvis?
Thanks. Okay. So generally, the textile and the apparel industry, correct me if I'm wrong, is considered sort of a low-tech industrialization, right? And often recommended as one of the low-hanging fruits. Sort of developing countries must sort of try to specialize in order to kickstart their industrialization process. I just wanted to check if, with the current development in terms of both technologies and then the sustainability issues, is it still a low-tech industrial sector? And if it is, what specific capabilities are emerging that we do see now that is needed in order to develop these new sort of industries in ways that leverages on the previous technologies, that leverages on the previous capabilities that were available in countries, for instance, like Ghana, who had some level of textile industry before. The second question I wanted to ask, forgotten now. I've forgotten.
I also didn't bring a pen, so I could forget. But so I wanted to pose a question to the panel, and then we'll just go through with, like, everyone can say something. You can also say something totally different if you have a new point you want to make. But you know, on the panel here, basically this is all foreign direct investment. Although I know UNOX has been in Abidjan for a very long time. But I think it highlights what I was trying to say about needing to bring the expertise and the technology into the countries. But it's not just that, it's also networks. So knowing the Chinese suppliers and being able to convince them. It's having operations in China and other Asian countries where you work with factories, where you then develop a technology. And there it's not so much about PET to polyester fiber, which is in a way an old tech, but it's the dyeing, as I understood. How do you then get the dyeing right? And that's where there's some proprietary or joint with some Asian, companies. So what we're seeing, it also has connections with other organizations. So I think the point I wanted to highlight is we need these foreign partnerships and these foreign networks. And I think because foreign direct investment in the past in African countries has been largely in extractives for a very long time, including when I was a grad student, there was just this negative perception of foreign direct investment, and it's had a spillover for a long time in public's imagination as linked with colonialism. And I think until we can move beyond that and see how foreign partnerships can help you to break out of subjective peripheral positions, we're not going to move anywhere. Having said that, what Korea and Taiwan did is not just leverage FDI, but use it to develop local firms. So I would ask you to think in the future how you might also, once you've done all these things that you're talking about, also create linkages with local investors or entrepreneurs to engage in tech transfer. So the first step, as I see it, is to bring it into the country, but that's not enough. And the second step is to also help build local firms with higher capabilities coming out of that. So to end, Ed, I think your point is a bigger one, and we can talk about it in the break, but as I write in the working paper, the main difference between the Ethiopia model and the ARISE model is in Ethiopia it was completely government driven in the sense that the government built the parks, and it did that with Eurobond money. That's a perfectly fine model. It's very expensive, and it's intensive in terms of building up capabilities of the country to run the parks. Now the government's talking about privatizing them, so that could be, but it's a good model, and everything is fine until they lost AGOA. It would have been on track to be something we cannot even understand. Like, it would have been massive. Okay, so the lesson there is don't have a civil war. But putting that point aside, the model is fine. It's just expensive. If you don't have that much money or you don't have that much political commitment, then the ARISE model is a good one because it requires government support in terms of credible commitment, the infrastructure, the side, but they don't have to put out a huge financial outlay, and they don't have to bring the technical expertise because ARISE comes with this huge team of Indian textile engineers who do everything. Whereas Arkebe really tried to build up at least some sense of expertise within the country, although people will criticize him that he didn't actually build up enough institutional expertise. But they're just two different models, but I think they work fine. It's about the political economy. And just very quickly on Elvis, I think it's wrong to say that apparel is the first step, because apparel has never driven industrialization. We could say textile is the first step because it requires running a firm with capital intensity and engineering skills and other skills. Apparel has always just exploited socially disadvantaged labor and become a labor subsidy or labor arbitrage for the rest of the world. It's not going to become high tech, but the fiber is going to change. Not tomorrow and not in 2 years, but in 10 years, most of the fiber in our clothing will be manufactured, and that's new technology, and that's an opportunity to get into that. Otherwise, instead of producing cotton in Cote d'Ivoire, we'll be importing various man-made cellulosic, biofabricated high-tech fibers from the West.
I think I can add one more. In terms of the polyester, the fabric mill, what we are going to do is like 90% water save compared to the existing process. So every time all the industrialists want to improve the process. So definitely, so you will not be in the same way what we did in last year. So definitely improvements comes, even though it may be in textiles, it may be in garmenting, because you know, every year you will have the increase in the cost. So everybody wants to bring the productivities in terms of technically on materials, maybe in the operation, or maybe the machineries that we are using. So definitely, the future of the business definitely will be more automated and more complicated, complex machineries and all. Yeah.
I think I can start adding on enabling local investors to be part of the industries that are coming up. I think that should happen biologically. If we think of industrial development, there are always first movers, but the spillover effect in the whole economy can set up the industries. Those models exist, but if the industry is a priority sector for the country, I think a lot of things will biologically develop. When it comes to technology, I think with regards to if we see different new materials that are coming up, it's not textile people who are developing these materials. It's very interesting if you see, because yearly there are big innovation competitions globally that are happening. And these people who are competing, it's quite impressive. They don't know anything about textile, really. So you can see how much technology plays a big role when it comes to building up new materials and fibers. That does not mean we will stop spinning. We will still spin it in the old model, because garment is fiber garment. This has been with us for centuries. It's not a rocket science, but the material itself is being developed by people in the laboratories who know nothing about textile. I think a year or 2 years back, we have seen a lab that produced cotton with nothing. These things are really happening on daily basis. So that's a great opportunity for researchers, for people who are into innovation and technology, to be part of that, that movement, because that is being supported by different organizations, but that is really happening as well. So we don't have to expect people to be direct players. So that advantage is always there. When it comes to PM, when it comes to for whom are we planning to supply, what will be the business model, we are having both in Benin as well as Togo. Benin projects, they are moving a bit faster compared to the Togo projects, but for both countries, the priority for us is to make sure that the cotton that's being produced in the country is utilized, the full supply chain exists within the country. In the long run, if this business is successful and we are able to bring more investors, of course, the regional integration would be the best model, because if we see West Africa, we have a lot of small countries. It's not like China and India, yeah? So the regional integration it's the best model, but for that to happen, first we need to make sure that we have successful projects in the countries. Then we will have the regional integration, which will have a better impact within the region. So the focus is to make sure that we use the local material, we set up the full vertical units within the countries, so that the value addition is within that context. I think I have touched everything. I think there was a question about Ethiopia. I'm in Arise, I'm based in Togo. Even if I'm Ethiopian, I have been part of that historical journey of textiles in Ethiopia. Okay, he has left. Yeah, okay. We can have the discussion on coffee further. There is a lot behind it.
We're out of time, but I just wanted to give Ersin a chance to respond. And Dasun, I don't know if you had said all you wanted to say. But
I actually have nothing to add. It's just maybe not the topic of today, but I have something as a food for thought, is that as much as today's topic is industrialization and manufacturing driven topics, I think the real question is, how can Africa or our countries in sub-Saharan Africa play a bigger role when it comes to brands? Because when you look at the value of companies, take on average a manufacturing company, its multiplier is about 2 or 3. When you talk brands, the average multiplier is 18. So if you really want to make a change, of course, there needs to be a certain transformation and manufacturing and industrial capability. But if you ask me, what is my personal ambition and motivation and vision for Uniwax, it's really about becoming a brand in the world that drives actually trends. Because even though it might be considered as a low value manufacturing, low hanging fruit kind of industry, look at other brands in the world when it comes to fashion and when it comes to textiles. They actually dominate what we call as in creating value for consumers. So if you look at what is happening in the world right now with the influence of Africa in food, in music, and in fashion, I think that's the wave that we should be riding, which requires, of course, first of all, that we get our bases right. But the value to me is in becoming brands and driving actually trends worldwide. So I hope that is something that we can achieve all together. Yeah.
sorry, we didn't have time for you to talk about your idea of ready-made garments. So if any of you are interested, you could talk about it in the break. But this idea of creating ready-made garments out of wax print, something that's not done yet, to be marketed in West Africa through apparel assembly, but also in the West, where there is a great growing demand for this. But Dasun, you want to on a last point?
One last point from my end, I think as Africa region, just want to like give an update on the potential of the business. Like if you see the apparel business is more than, I think, $1 trillion of business, out of which China is doing about 266 billion of out of that. And then you have Bangladesh and Vietnam, they do about 40 billion or 50 billion. So I don't think Africa is not even do a billion or lesser than that. So there's so much potential. If you see Bangladesh, you can see 5,000 to 6,000 factories in there. And same like Vietnam. Like knowing that China is getting expensive now, they're paying about a worker about $1,000. And Vietnam also like getting expensive and they want to go to high-tech industries, knowing that their cost is going up. So there's so much potential in African region. So only just that we need to have right systems, policies in place, and you need some expertise from Asian region definitely. It's difficult to build the business alone with the local teams. So you should get expertise from outside. And we had a like kind of research we did in our company, like can we do a kind of, we want to get some African hub to make sure brands should come here, because if you say alone DTRT alone, no, Ghana alone is like 30 million population here, so they don't want to come. So they need to see like as a overall maybe one West, maybe Togo, Ivory Coast, Benin, and Togo. Altogether, we can about have 60 million of population, maybe working population is about 22 million. So in that case, we can do about 20 billion or 30 billion of revenue out of the chunk. At least we can be happy, so that as a African region, we can increase the revenues from there. And a lot of people, like, you may think like as a service organization or manufacturing organization, so in this industry you are taking so many workforce, so you will get so many jobs created in the industry or the country, so it definitely improve your the cost of living and everything. Yeah.
Thank you so much. There's one issue we don't have time for, so I'll flag it now so we can come back in the last panel on political economy, because you worked in Kenya as well, and this investment in Ghana, DTRT, and also a lot of the new investments in Kenya, one could say they are investments in spite of the government, okay? So I wanted to probe that more. Maybe we can discuss it in tea, because I'm not sure if all of you will be here, but to probe that, my point is that there are things that can happen even if they're not, and they're driven by other factors. And it's important to understand what those other factors are, and a lot of times they're transnational networks. So the owner of your company, they have been in Africa. They have been working in factories in Tanzania and Madagascar. They're already here. Also in Kenya, there are other things drawing in investment. The Kenyan government doesn't do anything bad, but they also don't do that much at all. So there are other factors driving. So I'm just to say that we could go faster, no doubt, with government support, but we can still do things if we can understand what are the business strategies driving the first supplier firms and the buyers to do these things.
Yeah. Adding to on that, like for example, like Kenya. So the reason to Hella to go to Kenya is mainly the brand has pushed them to go there. So they were pushing them to go to Ethiopia and Kenya. So we were planned in Ethiopia and Kenya. So we were like had some challenges initially. So when you go somewhere, so we don't know how the people's chemical work and all is a bit of a different industry. Maybe whatever the strategies you do in Bangladesh may be different to Kenya. So you have to adapt for the situation and see what can be done. So yeah, so that's one of the reasons. That's why I said, so we need to first get the brands down there. So get the brands. So you should have at least to show we are par with Asia. So we should show the plants and all to the certain level that they can come and see, okay, so this is kind of a plant that we can use some orders. So when they give orders, so anyway we are competitive with polyesters and all, but as long run they need to see who can do the textile, who can do the fabric. So in that case, so PIA is doing a wonderful job there. So maybe cotton and all, we can source it from there. So the polyesters, which the same business we are doing right now. So we are sure that we can, if we are invest on fabric mill, we have the same business through the same customer. So yeah, so it's different parameters are there, but governments also playing a major role. For example, Bangladesh. So when you compare with the Bangladesh, so Bangladesh, the Apparel Association and the government have a very good relationship. For example, during the COVID time, so all the factories are affected and they were hold their orders, and the Apparel Association went back to government, said we can't pay salaries. So they funded all the factories for 4 to 5 months. I was there those days, so I know. So those kind of strategies. So in here we don't see those. Yeah.
So please just give a hand to the wonderful private sector. Yay! that I did not write this program. And I did not put myself in this many positions of speaking on purpose, nor would I ever have done so. So I'm really, in any case, I have the great opportunity to be the moderator, not the speaker, of this first roundtable. So the program, I think as Charles outlined, has several thematic discussions with scene-setting pieces and a couple of roundtables. So in the roundtable, we've just set the topic and then invited quite a few speakers of relevance in the private and public sector, as well as the university, the academic sector, to speak to the topic. So the topic of the first roundtable is regional opportunities for green industrial development, where I think regional can take on several different meanings, depending on how you think of it, but of course also at the Pan-African region, and we'll have quite a few speakers who will talk about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. So on that note, actually, let me just say it's hybrid. So on this panel, most of our speakers are online, but we do have one in-person speaker. So I'll introduce that person first and invite them up. So we have Daniel Sowa, am I pronouncing it correctly? From the Ministry of Trade and Industry here in Ghana. So please take a seat with one of the microphones. And I'm just going to stay here so that I can see the screen instead of sitting in the chair. And then online joining us, we have Francis Mangini from the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. We have Seth Akwaboa from the Association of Ghana Industries. I believe he's the CEO. We have Anthony. So what we've done is to pose a series of questions to each of the speaker around their expertise. So I'm not even going to really give an introductory speech, but really just go to the roundtable members and launch straight into a debate. I'll take some notes and then try to ask them challenging questions as we go along. Can I just see if everybody is there? Francis, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Seth, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, and I see Anthony and I see Jody. And Patrick, are you with us? Great. Okay. So let's just launch straight in, and I'm going to go in the order. And they have been given the prep documents, so you can speak to what you ask, and you can also go rogue and speak to whatever you want to if you don't like the questions that have been posed. I think the idea is really to explore regional opportunities. Some of this was already mentioned, I think also in Chima's question. But let's start, Patrick, with your position. So one of the questions that has been put down for you is really, I think, about also, well, here it says the global community, but I think also the development partners here taking on the idea about how can development assistance, as it's called these days, or the global community support green industrialization processes in Africa. So the question to you is, what is the most strategic pathway for the global community to support Africa's sustainable industrialization? And then I would just add to that, should the international community and development partners evolve, change the way that they give support for economic transformation on the continent? One could question if they've actually ever given support for economic transformation on the continent, which I think was also in the blurb, this criticism of actually the way in which development assistance has been given in the past hasn't really supported industrialization at all. And now we're asking, how can it support green industrialization? So what is the best way for them to do that, do you think? Is it changing current tools? And then I added a question to that, which is, how can development partners support industries and local firms in African countries to facilitate technology transfer and participation in new technologies? And can they even, do their mechanisms and modes of giving support even really allow them to do that? Looking at the ways in which they have and have not supported African firms and industries in the past. So a bunch of questions to you, but just to, we wanted to get your thoughts on the topic.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me first? Can you hear me? Yes, loud and clear. Thank you very much. So, first of all, I would like to express our sincere, appreciation to ASEC for, inviting the African Union Commission to share, its view in this important, gathering that we're having today. The question that you are asking is truly aligned, with the new dynamics with regards to what the African Union Commission and the African Union as a whole is trying to achieve to make sure that we are able to accelerate productive transformation, and not only productive transformation, but wide industrialization in a drive to achieve sustainability and to unlock the potential of the continent. You ask a critical question: if the development assistance has ever supported Africa's industrialization, and the response is no, not at all. Because it is not about policies, it is not about lack of commitments, because commitments were made. But have we reached the, the opportunity or the pace where the commitments are, fully implemented in terms of what needs to be done to support Africa's industrialization and productive transformation? Let me just take one example to make sure that we are able to understand the magnitude of the problem. In 2020, when we entered the COVID-19 pandemic, and now with the Russia-Ukraine crisis, you can see that, there is a disruption of the global supply chains. And this disruption of global supply chain has extremely hit the continent, because as of today, we are not able to produce the goods that we are aiming to consume in the framework of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is one of the flagship programs that we are also conducting with regards to accelerating productive transformation. Looking at that, you will see that the flow of resources that we've received, since the decade 2000s, you will see that those resources were not, directly going to the productive sector. You will also hear that the continent is heavily indebted today, with debts that are already, beyond the 70% of the GDP in most of our countries. And those countries are now in debt distress. The resources that we are getting, in the international markets are just resources that are aimed at, dealing with pro-cyclical issues. And unfortunately, those resources are not aimed to, to accelerate productive transformation and to be invested for a long term. So if you see the needs of the continent today in terms of industrialization, there is need for us to have resources that are available for a longer period of time to make sure that the resources are able to be productive enough. And if you look at, the flow of, FDI, foreign direct investment within the country, you see that since the decade, since 2010, we can see a decrease of FDIs, despite the fact that if you look at what was happening before, in the decades before, we are certainly seeing an increase. But unfortunately, if you take the global average, you will see that we are below that average and even far. So there is need for us to really look at, the opportunities that are offered in terms of the resources that we can get. Even the financial system, the international financial system didn't work for Africa. And this is why we are strongly calling for the deep reform of the international financial architecture, which is driven by the IMF and the World Bank, because those institutions, despite the support that they have provided, that support has not been effective enough, to unlock the potential of the continent in terms of productive transformation. It is true that efforts needs to be done, at country level, at regional level, and even at the continental level, to make sure that we are creating the right environment that will attract investments. But if you look at the trends of reforms within the continent, in the last 2 decades, you will see that we have been reforming a lot, but unfortunately, we are still unable to attract the resources that are needed to accelerate productive transformation. Let me just another example. You will see that with the Russia-Ukraine war, the World Bank and the IMF, not World Bank, IMF disbursed an amount of nearly, slightly $1 billion to the overall sub-Saharan Africa. We don't like that denomination, but just to give an example, the sub-Saharan Africa, including Nigeria and, which are the major economy in the continent, we just had less than $1 billion. But if you look at what another country that is facing also challenges received to, to try to sustain peace, they receive an amount of $15.6 billion US. Just like that. This is resource that we need to make sure that we are able to, accelerate productive transformation. To conclude, there is also these, discussions that we are having in terms of repatriation of stolen assets from Africa. When we talk about this, we talk about illicit financial flows. There is need for, to work on the, the implementation of commitments that were made to make sure that we are able to repatriate those resources that can lead, to productive transformation. But when you try to ask those resources, you will see that there are conditionalities, and they are your resources, conditionalities to access those resources and to make sure that they are able to, to work for the issues that we are faced with. So this is the context. And I can recall that last year in November 2022, we had in Niamey, Niger, a summit on industrialization and economic transformation. The summit was also a high-level African policy dialogue platform that called upon, each country and where commitments were made to accelerate industrialization. And I do recall that there were several partner institutions that were also participating in that process. But what we need to be mindful of is that nobody will come here to transform Africa. It is, the responsibility, the historical responsibility of Africans to do so. But there is need for a conducive international environment that can allow us to navigate in that direction. You are in Accra, Ghana. You may also know about, the consequences that were, brought by the, the three credit rating agencies when they, they downgraded, Ghana in terms of, rating. But in the same time, you have companies in Europe, you have banks in Europe and in America that are triple rated, that can fail just in a moment. But our countries have not failed, but unfortunately, the international system is not designed to allow us to get the resources that we need. We were talking about green industrialization. What does it mean for Africa? It means nothing. For us, it means nothing. With 3% of emission of greenhouse gas, the pressure is much more on Africa than any other continent to decarbonize its industry. Which industry are we decarbonizing? What are we doing? So you can see that you have 3% contribution on a global environment where there are problems, but the pressure is on you. Lastly, if you look at the financing that are needed to accelerate green industrialization, Africa has only received less than an amount of 2.7% of the commitments that were made. So you can see that even the commitments are below, our level of emission. So there is need for, a constructive discussion around these questions to make sure that when commitments are made, that actions are following up the implementation. This is what I can say for introducing, and would like to thank you, Madam Chair, for giving me the floor. Over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. Just to ask a follow-up question, I think everything that you have said is not surprising to those of us in the room who have been following economic transformation for decades. And so what you say now is basically the same thing that has been in place for decades. So given that the Western international financial institutions are not playing that role and aren't really institutions that you could turn to as the African Union Commission, then what could be alternatives? And I said this in the morning, we know that things don't work. So instead of continuing to look at them thinking that they might work, could we not seek out new, innovative ways of doing things? And so what could you see as alternative pathways? And just to throw out an idea, like, you know, how could the African Union Commission play a role in trying to attract foreign direct investment, for example, at a regional level? How could you look to non-Western finance institutions that operate differently but with their own challenges, the Asia Development Bank, or even just other governments or firms in Asia? I mean, just a different way of thinking. Instead of always turning to the World Bank and the IMF, we know the constraints, we know what they will do, we know what they won't do. But over the last 3 decades, the world has actually changed, and there are alternatives. And how could maybe the AU tap into those alternatives and leverage partnerships and financing from different players?
Thank you very much. Quite an interesting question. What we are trying to, to promote at the AU level is self-reliance on our resources. The first thing is to make sure that we are able to, to collect efficiently the domestic resources. And in this, we talk about tax administration, to make sure that we are able to accelerate, the transformation in that sector specifically, to make sure that we are able to adequately collect our domestic resources and make sure that the domestic resources are channeled to finance